Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om skräckserieskaparen David Hines. I augusti 2017 så upptäckte jag David Hines skräckserieroman, eller graphic novel som det heter på engelska. Boken heter Strange Embrace. Det är en sällsam upplevelse när man i vuxen ålder upptäcker ett verk som gör djupt intryck. Och det här var definitivt ett sådant verk. Manuset är exceptionellt. Det råder ingen tvekan om att man befinner sig i en mästarhistorieberättares närvaro i Strange Embrace. Davids tecknarstil är bra, men det är lite skitsamma för det finns hur många skickliga tecknare som helst där ute, men nästan ingen med Davids idéer och berättarteknik. När jag precis hade läst Strange Embrace så började jag pitcha den till alla jag kände, och min pitch, utan att spoila helheten, blev att den handlar om en tankeläsare som blir less på mänsklighetens banalitet och förutsägbarhet, så han isolerar sig och börjar läsa böcker. Därför att i romanen så kan han ju inte läsa huvudpersonernas tankar och handlingen förblir då oförutsägbar. Men så en dag så möter han en märklig, tystlåten enstöring som bor i ett stort hus med massa märkliga statyer och masker. Han är den första människa vars tankar han inte kunnat läsa, och såklart så blir han besatt av att ta reda på vem han är. Han flyttar in i huset och börjar spionera på honom och skriva ner hans historia som en berättelse. Och det är här som den före detta tankeläsaren, som sedan blev läsare av böcker, nu blir en författare. Det här är alltså bara en liten del av historien, men jag tycker att det här är den bästa pitchen för att intressera någon som vill läsa boken. Boken har en struktur som bygger på en struktur som jag tidigare tagit upp i ett avsnitt av Udda Ting. Avsnittet om Dan O'Bannon tror jag det var. Och tekniken kallas Frames of Remove. Det är alltså en berättare som berättar om en annan person som kanske då i sin tur berättar om sin historia. Så att tekniken har en poäng i att man får olika pusselbitar från olika karaktärer som till slut avslöjar plotten som helhet. Det märks att det här är inget hastverk. David har lagt ner lång tid på det här manuset. Så det var faktiskt min första fråga till David. How did you go about writing the story of Strange Embrace and how long did it take?
Yeah, I mean, I'd been working on it, writing notes for, God, I don't know how long, years and years and years. It was always in the back of my mind that this was the book I wanted to do. Everything else I did, I always felt like, okay, this is what I'm doing to pay the rent. But what I really want to do is this book, Strange Embrace. And the problem is, if you do comics as your day job, it's very hard to focus in your time off, and do more comics. And I could see it was never going to get done unless I just stopped doing everything and focused on that. But certainly the ideas had been in my head, actually going back and embarrassing a long time. I think it all started when I was at art college in the late 1970s, and when I left home, I was living with another student in this house, which is very much like the house of Anthony Corbeau. There was this old guy who lived downstairs, huge house. He owned it, but he had a housekeeper who looked after him, and she basically told us, oh, his wife committed suicide. And he's just lived here alone ever since. And that was the germ of the idea, I think. And it just took me 20 odd years to get around to turning it into a story.
So how much of that real guy went into your story?
There were elements that I didn't use in the end. The housekeeper's husband was completely insane. And one night, me and my friend came back from the pub, walked into the house, and the housekeeper said, ignore everything, go up to your room, because we lived up in the attic. And as we went up the stairs, her husband was there with an axe. There was a door covered with blood. He'd hacked a hole in it, and we could see a face on the other side of the hole, which was the guy's son. Apparently they'd had a really bad argument, and so that was pretty weird. And we just kind of edged our way past him, and then the police turned up. And
how did you go about constructing the narrative of the story?
well, I made notes, as I say, over the space of decades. But when I actually decided to start writing, I pretty much had the idea in my head by then. I spent six months doing nothing but writing the script. Then I started drawing, and the drawing took about 18 months. And as I was drawing, I was also rewriting, because I had that luxury, because I'm the writer as well as the artist. I could, change things as I went along. I wrote it more like a movie screenplay. So I didn't have as much description, and I hadn't broken it down into panels, because I knew that I was going to do that when I came to draw. So it was more free-flowing. I mean, when I'm writing scripts for other people, I'm always aware of where the page breaks are going to be and how many panels to the page. And it becomes a little more regimented. And I had a lot more freedom with this. I could keep on making changes. And I discarded some pages completely. The only real framework, I knew I wanted to publish them, it had to be 4 issues of 48 pages, because I didn't expect to be able to find someone who would publish it as a graphic novel straight away. So I kept that discipline, making sure that there were natural breaks after 48 pages each time. The story breaks one of those rules of storytelling, whether it's a movie or a novel. You're supposed to decide what your story is or what your genre is, and you shouldn't change direction. So the story started off as Alex's story, quite a supernatural thing, and then switches to this kind of gothic, romantic horror. So it kind of switches genres, and there was a point where I thought, should I just drop the whole framing sequence and just make it the story? But I'm glad I didn't. That was the one doubt I had, whether that actually worked, the supernatural element, and whether I wasn't kind of, I don't know, I felt like I was almost cheating by adding supernatural elements to make it more interesting. But I can't help it. Everything I do has some kind of fantastical element to it. So in the end, I just followed my instinct. Thought, well, what the hell? I'm trying to think about the other influences. Oh, the African art influence, of course, was a big thing. I started getting interested in African masks and sculptures about 1980, when I started going out with my girlfriend Vicky, who lived in Paris, and there were a lot of markets there because Paris has quite a big immigrant population from Africa. You have access to a lot of these African sculptures, which were really cheap. You could pick them up in marketplaces. And one of the first pieces that I started with was one that my girlfriend bought me in that market. And I started getting really interested in all kinds of masks and sculptures, African fetishes. And that became useful as a kind of iconography of the book. Because I found African art interesting because it's not art in the same way that Western art is. It's always functional. You don't create a piece of artwork just to decorate. It always has a function, whether it's as a fetish. There are these objects that are given to pregnant women that they focus on so that their child will be born with beautiful features. There are others that are masks for, adolescent rituals. Every mask has a function. So art isn't separated from normal everyday life.
So why did you put the masks in the story?
I wanted some kind of visual motif that would reflect the kind of the pain and the isolation of the characters, and those masks. I always felt there was something. I forget the line that I used, but the character Sarah looks at them at one stage and talks about what is it? Something to do with it, being able to find a direct expression of your life and your feelings that aren't kind of filtered through the kind of stylistic, superficial aspects of art that we have in most Western art. So it was really about finding a more pure visual expression, not only for storytelling purposes, but also to express those deeper, more universal emotions of the characters. I mean, it comes through the biggest influence all the way through the 20th century. You had this influence of African art on expressionism, cubism. You know, Picasso and Braque and all those artists were going directly to African art and looking at it as a form of art that wasn't based on. There was a really fresh style, because Western art was getting obsessed with realism, and after photography came along, which was a perfect representation of realism, art was looking for some other form of expression, and they found it through that, what some people mistakenly call primitive art. But I think Picasso and those other people recognized a kind of purity in that art.
Did you have the story as a whole first and later decided on this structured storytelling, or did you investigate the story as it is written, letting it unfold?
Yeah, there's basically three narrators. There's Alex, who is this kind of almost supernatural character, who is a psychic, who collects stories, and he kind of collects people at the same time. And he comes across the character of Anthony Corbeau in his old age, and moves into the house with him and learns his story. And as he kind of acquires the story, he almost seems to take possession of the character. But because he's learning the story by reading Anthony Corbeau's mind, he's picking the story up in a non-linear way. And it's an incomplete version of the story. So you've got his narration, which kind of shifts into Anthony Corbeau's narration. Of course, Anthony Corbeau himself never knew the whole story. He knew the story from his point of view, and that's what I found interesting. Was you have the entire narrative there up until the point until her suicide. And it's like a mystery, like a thriller. Half the story is missing, and this is what became interesting. I wasn't sure what the other half of the story was either, and I actually dreamt it. I had a dream where I woke up. I dreamt that I woke up. I hadn't actually woken up. In my dream, I went up into this attic, and there was a chest of drawers, and this is very much like what happens in the book. And I opened this drawer, and inside there was a mummified embryo. And then I turned around, and Sarah and Edward, the characters, were standing behind me. And Sarah was just pointing at this mummified embryo. And I thought, oh, right, okay, that's it. And the rest of the story just came out of my subconscious, this whole relationship with Edward and the syphilitic baby and all those things. Yeah, they came from my subconscious in some strange way. So that was interesting. So I wrote that into the story. There's a digital version of the graphic novel on a site called Sequential, who do digital versions of comics with a lot of extras. And on that, there's the original script. I believe I've got the original script on there, as well as the script I actually used. And in the original script, there were at least 50 more pages of material that I just didn't use in the end. There was a lot more about Sukumar. There were scenes of him almost drowning, which reflected in the story in the end by the opening scene where you see him apparently swimming underwater, which again is kind of in his imagination because he's actually just staring into a fishbowl and he's getting those glimpses in the water where he imagines himself swimming there and meeting the character Alex. There's a lot of kind of, I suppose it's borderline psychedelic imagery, really.
That's a good one, borderline psychedelic. Did you invent that expression?
It's in black and white, so it can't be full-on psychedelic. And I was going to leave in the scene with the axe attack. But I realized it was just, I was losing the focus of the story if I did that. It's important to be able to get rid of the stuff that's not really working, even if you like the scenes, you know.
Okay, so Strange Embrace was a black and white miniseries published almost 30 years ago. So when did it get colorized in a collected edition?
There was quite a long involved publishing history, really. I mean, we were originally published by Tundra back in 1993. I don't know if you know anything about Tundra Comics. It's really interesting. There's a guy called Kevin Eastman who was one of the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He and Greg Laird, I think, was the other guy who... They were very canny. They kept all of the rights to the Turtles. So when it got big, and there's the movies and the merchandise, they had huge amounts of cash. And Kevin Eastman decided to set up his own publishing company, which is still, I mean, it still publishes heavy metal now, I think. But they had a UK office run by a guy called Dave Elliott, and they were publishing masses of books. And I'd finished the script. I had the first 20 or 30 pages drawn. And I had planned to just finish the entire book and then try and find a publisher. But when Tundra appeared, and they were, you know, really getting a lot of offbeat, cultish sort of stuff that they were publishing, they were paying good money for it. So I thought, I can't miss out on this. And I went to see Dave Elliott, showed him the 20 or 30 pages I had done, and he just said on the spot, yeah, we'll do it. And there was no editorial influence at all, so I was allowed to just go ahead and do exactly what I'd planned, which was great, but also getting an income. So that was the original publication, 4 issues, 48 pages. Then there was a big crash in the independent comics market, which happened right at the point that I was getting published. So 1993, this complete crash. The company went bust. I think the 4th volume of Strange Embrace was the last thing that was published. So I was really lucky to get the whole thing out there. But because it didn't sell very well, I actually gave up doing comics for 10 years. I thought, that's it. That was the comic book I wanted to do. Didn't sell. The company went bust. And I spent nearly a decade just doing freelance illustration instead. And then, 2003, this guy Richard Starkings, who I'd known at Marvel UK way back, called me from the United States and said, hi, do you remember me? I hadn't seen him for like 15 years. He said, I want to republish Strange Embrace as a collected graphic novel. I said, yeah, okay. And from there, it really snowballed because he invited me out to San Diego Comic-Con. And this is a point where I'd really given up on comics. That was very useful for me because it got me introduced to a lot of people. And through that book, that's why I ended up writing for Marvel, because the editor-in-chief read Strange Embrace. So I hadn't expected that. I really didn't think it was going to be my way into mainstream comics.
As you said, the structure and unfolding of the events are pretty offbeat, but because it has this amazing power to hold your interest, it works.
I think that is one of the reactions I get from a lot of people, is that it's a page turner. And I think no matter how offbeat the work you're doing is, you owe it to the story and therefore owe it to your audience to keep them interested. The only real crime that a storyteller can commit is to bore the audience.
Have you done any other work that's in the same vein as Strange Embrace?
I've just finished a book called Lip Hook, which is a graphic novel of 160 pages. Mark had heard about a story of a cult in Mexico in the early 1960s, where these guys went to a village with a couple of prostitutes and convinced the locals that these prostitutes were actually goddesses. I think they painted them gold and stuff. And they set up a cult that ended up involving human sacrifice and all kinds of drug taking and weird orgies. True story. And in the end, a kid saw one of their rituals where they were killing someone. He ran to a local village to tell the police what he'd seen. They didn't believe him, but one cop came back with him, was never seen again. And it ended up with the local militia surrounding the town, a big shootout. It's an incredible story. And what I did was took that story, reworked it, made it a smaller, more personal story, and set it in an English village. So the story starts with a car, an American 1950s Cadillac, speeding along a country road. It's full of bullet holes. They're obviously being chased. Turn off down this narrow road towards a town called Lip Hook, which also says dead end. And as they go down the road, they drive into fog. And out of the fog come all these very strange insects that start splattering on the windscreen. So they stop the car, the woman gets out, cleans the windscreen, and a strange figure appears out of the mist. And the figure breaks up into a cloud of moths that covers her. This has kind of transformative effects on her. From there, the thief and the prostitute continue on to the village. And after that, it kind of follows this story from the 1960s. They set up a cult within the village and gradually take over control of the village. So it's a little like those English stories like The Wicker Man. That's probably the closest thing that I've done to Strange Embrace.
So when will this be released?
We finished it literally 1.5 weeks ago. It went off to the printer. It's going to be released at the Lakes Comic Festival in October, I believe.
You also did a comic book adaptation of Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space with Mark.
That was a great one to do, Color Out of Space, because the whole point of The Color Out of Space is that this asteroid strikes the Earth and there's this mysterious emanation from the asteroid, which is a colour that has never been seen by human eye. So I wrote the script and basically said to Mark, when it comes to the emanation, I said, you've got to find some way of producing a colour that no human eye has ever seen before. So he said, thanks a lot, Dave. But he found a really good solution to it, because what he did was he coloured the story in quite a kind of, it was digital, but it still had a very hand-drawn look until The Color Out of Space. And he used a digital effect. And because the story is set in the 19th century, when this digital effect comes in, it has exactly that effect of being something you've never seen before.
Could you talk about your Victor Hugo adaptation, The Man Who Laughs?
But that was at the time when I was working on Batman books for DC. And one of the stories, I wrote a story featuring a French version of the Joker. It was set in Paris. And I kind of rewrote the story of, or the origin of the Joker, so that it was a bit closer to Victor Hugo's story. So this guy who became the Joker had an insane father who deliberately mutilated his own child as an artistic act, if you like. Now, because I knew that the Joker was originally created based on a movie poster from The Man Who Laughs, the 1927 version. So I knew that the Joker had actually come from the Victor Hugo story. So I was just playing around with that. I hadn't actually read the original novel. And after I'd finished that story, I thought, well, I ought to check it out. So I tracked down a copy, and it's quite hard to find, actually, in English. There's not a lot of people who are familiar with it, really. And this big doorstop book came through post, 800 pages. And I started reading it. It's essentially the story of a young kid who is he's traveling with a group of people called Comprachicos, who are kind of like Romanis. They're traveling people who are they're entertainers, but they've got strange kind of entertainment. And part of it is they mutilate children to display as freaks. And there's this kid who has this distorted face, who's abandoned by them, and in the middle of a snowstorm. And in that snowstorm, he comes across a baby that he rescues, and he then encounters a traveling philosopher who called Ursus, who travels with a wolf called Homo. So the wolf is the man, and the man is called Bear. And he takes the Man Who Laughs, this mutilated kid, with him, and starts to travel the country, and they become quite popular as entertainers. And it's quite an intriguing story. I mean, I wouldn't want to give away too much of it, but there's a reason why this kid was mutilated, and it turns out that he does have a background that is aristocratic. I mean, it's a very political book. It's about the inequalities of the English political system. I think he actually gives a statistic where he says that 90% of the wealth is owned by 10% of the people, which to Victor Hugo was just totally unacceptable. He was a Republican. He was against royalty. He was against the aristocracy. And it's interesting because everything that he said, including those statistics, are still true today. In fact, I think it's even worse. I think it's more like 95% of the wealth is owned by 5% of the people. I just found the story totally intriguing. It was a love story. It was a historical mystery. It was a horror story, and it had this very strong political element that I found very appealing. The problem with the story is that of those 800 pages, at least 400 were extremely boring and repetitive. For instance, there were lists of all the property that was owned by the 150 aristocratic families of England, listed in detail.
But a lot of books were written like that back then. I mean, Moby Dick has this tedious fact section on whale hunting in the middle of the book.
A good part of Moby Dick was taken almost directly, I think, from a book on whaling. And I think in both cases, the writers really wanted to make their work. They wanted the authenticity. They wanted to show the research. It doesn't bother me so much in Moby Dick, actually. I actually find that the entire book intriguing. I never get turned off by all that detail, particularly as the detail of Moby Dick includes kind of crawling inside a sperm whale's head to get to the whatever that stuff is that's in the brain of the sperm whale. I find all that stuff, even though it's the factual detail, it's so bizarre. I'm still entertained by it. But anyway, going back to The Man Who Laughs, I could see there was clearly a brilliant story there, and it just needed, I know it's kind of, I mean, Victor Hugo is one of the greatest writers of all time, but he needed editing. He really seriously needed an editor. And so a big part of the process was cutting out 50% of the material, then rearranging the narrative structure, and just focusing on the character development, things like that. And we also I also emphasized certain elements of it. To me, when the kid goes into the storm, it's almost as if he and the baby that he finds, that's where they were supposed to die. And by the fact that he finds her and then is rescued by this character Ursus, it's almost as if their death is deferred. So everything that happens after that is almost like a gift to them. But they still had, and so if you know the story, at the end you almost get back to that moment in the snowstorm. So there were things that I did with it to place emphasis on different aspects of the story, and I wanted to make it more cinematic as well. There are quite long sections where there's no words interrupting the visual flow at all. So yeah, that was. I mean, I apart from that Lovecraft story, I'd never really done adaptations before, but this was a story I really wanted to reinterpret and kind of represent to a modern audience who probably would never struggle through the original 800-page novel.
The previous episode of Udda Ting was about David Lynch's Eraserhead, and somehow I can see an influence there.
Eraserhead is probably, for me, the most important movie I ever saw. I remember seeing it. It must have been when it first came out at a movie club in London. And I just remember coming out from it. It's like I just didn't know what I'd seen. We came out of the cinema and walked into, there was a lift going down to the tube. And I don't know whether it was the influence of the movie. We got into this lift and it started making all these strange noises that were exactly like in the movie. There's like hisses, like steam escaping and clanking, and it was like, I was almost half convinced going down in that lift that when we came out, we were going to see like the radiator lady. But yeah, that movie, again, very experimental, very not a traditional narrative at all, but you're totally intrigued the whole time. You're never bored. You want to know what's going to happen next.
In the episode I made, there's a part of an interview I did with Lynch about characters' names, the importance of character names. Is that important to you?
That is interesting, actually, naming characters. I always find that, you'll start coming up with a story and developing characters, and choosing the names is incredibly important and quite hard sometimes. Names don't just pop into your head. I do all kinds of things I've done things like, for one story I wrote for DC Comics, every single character was a female painter from the 20th century. I just went through this, and there's some great names, like Kahlo or whatever. But even the planets were named after those things. It's always easier to come up with a theme like that. Otherwise, you end up going through the phone book. You can go past 500 names before you actually come across something that seems appropriate. But it is incredibly important. As soon as you've got the name of the character, he's absolutely right. It kind of defines the character in your head.
Was there other influences at the time? I mean, comic book influences?
One of the most influential things that I was reading was Joe's Bar. The stories are all crime stories, superficially, but they're always far more about real-world people, and it's very much about immigrants, about the working classes. It's about prostitutes and junkies, but from a very sympathetic perspective. I hate it, actually, when people say, "So, what do you recommend?" I just read too much stuff. I'm afraid it will. I'm convinced that The fact that older people have problems with their memory is nothing to do with the fact that our memory is failing. It's the fact that we've got so much information after all these decades of filling our heads with movies and books and comics. It just gets this incredible mess inside your head.
Avslutningsvis så skulle jag vilja uppmana alla lyssnare som är fans av weird fiction, skräck och surrealistiska mardrömshistorier att kolla in Strange Embrace, en av de bästa graphic novels jag har läst. Och med de orden så avslutar vi dagens avsnitt. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då!